Are you starting?
You can go to the next
Go
one.
ahead.
Oh, go to the next one. Okay.
Hi, so we are from Vista Del Lago, Team 1, and my name is Eileen Kim.
I'm Jessica Wu.
I'm Avni Duda.
And I'm Adelie.
Okay, so first we're going to get into a little bit of background information about the useful forest. So the useful forest is the largest forest conservation in California, located in Mendocino County. It's roughly 50,000 acres of redwood forest, primarily younger forest, ranging from 30 to 39 years of age, and around 40% of this forestry is hardwoods. So the Redwood Forest Foundation, Inc. is what owns the useful forest, and they were launched in 1997, and their mission is to acquire, protect, restore, and manage forest lands and other related sources in the Redwood region for the long-term benefit of the communities located there. So here's a little bit of a timeline. I'm just going to go over the main points. So in the 1940s to 90s, there was a logging community established near useful forest, and because of industrialization, the housing boom, things like that, it led to over-harvesting, leaving the redwood population struggling. Then in 1987, environmental activists began protesting the clear-cutting of the redwoods, and then in 2007, the useful forest was purchased by the Redwood Forest Foundation, Inc.
So here are the land ownership goals. Top tier are 1 and 2. The RFFI hopes to increase the amount of conifers, particularly coastal redwoods, to resemble a pre-settlement composition at USAL. Another goal is to create an economic benefit to invest into forest activities, as well as contribute to the local economy. Secondary goals include minimizing herbicides, sequestering carbon, and reducing fire risk.
So as its name kind of suggests, restoration forestry is restoring the forest to its pre-settlement, pre-colonial stand conditions. And specifically in regards to the useful forest, this would look like having less trees per acre, higher species composition, specifically more conifers and redwood trees, as well as overall larger diameter and height.
So next I'm going to talk about data collection methods. So USAL quantifies forest health using forest inventory in order to achieve its goals. So ideally you'd sample every single tree with more plots, but this will take a very long time, so instead, foresters sample plots, reducing time and effort. So you can calculate stand density using trees per acre or basal area. Trees per acre can be calculated by dividing the number of trees by the number of acres, and basal area is the sum of the cross-sectional areas of each tree. So in this picture, the basal area would be 24 feet squared. Now you can use basal area and trees per acre to help you determine if the stand is stocked, overstocked, or fully stocked, or understocked. Now for a fixed plot type, the end trees would be within the center of the radius of the plot circle. For a variable plot, you would find the end trees by using an angle gauge or a wedge prism. And at USAL, generally they have a basal area factor of 40, but occasionally they use 20. And you would calculate the basal area by multiplying the number of end trees by the basal area factor. So next are a few inventory measurements. To measure diameter at breast height, you could use a Biltmore stick or a diameter tape, and you would measure at 4.5 feet high, which is breast height. To measure the height of the tree, you can use a clinometer as seen in the picture or a Biltmore stick. And ideally, you would measure one chain away from the tree, which is 66 feet. And lastly is volume. So if you already have height and diameter, you can calculate the volume of a tree using a volume table like this one of a ponderosa pine, and it would calculate volume in board feet. So these are the units that we will be investigating today. So on the left, we have Upper Piercy Creek units, and on the right, we have Cinnamon Bear units. So USAL uses a 5x5 chain grid system when determining plots, and they have 3 main inventory plot types. A variable plot for if the tree is greater than or equal to 5 inches diameter, a fixed plot for diameters less than 5 inches, and a tally plot, which is every other plot where they kind of estimate some of the data.
So using the data collection methods that Jessica just discussed, we're going to address the current mixed conifer stand condition. So currently there's around 14,900 acres of the USAL forest, and 30% of that is the mixed hardwood conifer, shown through the peach color on the map, and these are areas that needs to be restored. And for the sake of the forestry challenge, we're going to be focusing on the Upper Piercy Creek and Cinnamon Bear units. According to Jeff Hauser, the forest manager for USAL Forestry, the current conditions of the USAL forest is that it includes poorly distributed conifers and high amounts of densely packed tan oaks. There is also excessive fuel loading on the ground due to forest management activities. And here's some drone pictures of the units.
So you can also quantify stand conditions using forest inventory. So this is collected by James Abel Forestry, who USAL works with to collect forest inventory. And this one is of 2020 of the forest stands we're talking about. So this table includes the number of acres and plots, the basal area per acre for different tree species, the average diameter, board feet volume per acre, and trees per acre. And as you can see, the stands are really crowded with an average of 612.9 trees per acre. And they're also very thin trees with an average diameter of 5.56. And there are definitely not enough redwoods compared to hardwoods and Douglas fir. So this just shows that this area is in strong need of restoration.
Okay, so after reviewing current stand conditions, we need to address how to manage conifers and tan oaks. And this can be done through a process that we call silviculture. And so silviculture is basically the science of managing a stand of trees for a desired outcome. So as I kind of mentioned earlier, and in order to meet the demands of the late 20th century, the USAL forest underwent a lot of clear cutting, and then recently it began using a lot of variable retention strategies. Variable retention, as Jeff Hauser, a professional forester at USAL Forest, likes to call it, he basically calls it a do-over. And this is done in order to restructure the forest and to improve biodiversity. And this is because under variable retention, foresters are allowed to selectively decide what and where they want to cut, and so that it allows them to cut trees for their value and allows them to provide space for incoming redwoods. And so this creates this kind of clumpy, gappy effect, and this is similar to what we would expect pre-settlement conditions to look like. Another type of silviculture is selection harvest, and this moves an existing forest stand to an uneven age distribution, and this can be done through either group selection or single selection harvest.
So here are the different treatment options to manage tan oaks at USAL. You could conduct no treatment, and the pros that would cost no money, but by not thinning or maintaining the forest, it would be overcrowded, and during fires, this could lead to risk. Tan oaks would also continue to outcompete redwoods. On the other hand, conducting a manual treatment can be beneficial because cutting trees down by hand causes them to lay flat on the floor, and so they won't act as a ladder fuel. Manual treatments also do not introduce any chemicals, but by paying for the manual labor, it's very expensive and costs $450 per acre. Trees can also resprout as chemicals aren't truly killing them at the roots, and so tan oak stumps might lead to the regeneration of new trees. Another option would be frilling, where an axe is used to apply herbicides. This kills tan oaks to the roots, so it will eventually die, but it will remain standing upright. And this method is roughly 1/2 the price of a manual treatment at $200 per acre. It prevents regrowth, and according to Jeff Hauser, stags created by frilling can provide shelter and a food source for wildlife. However, another registered forester, David Thompson, who works in El Dorado County today, warns us that these snags can be a safety hazard or act as a ladder fuel that allows fires to climb into the crown. Frilling also introduces chemicals.
So using this knowledge, here are the 13 different pathways for managing hardwoods and conifers in the USAL forest. So when deciding what pathway to choose, we should compare the cost. And as you can see here, pathways 2 to 10 use variable retention. And for the most part, the final cost is a negative value, except for pathway 10, which has a very small positive revenue. Contrastingly, pathways 11 to 13 use selection harvest, and they have a very high monetary gain, ranging from around $350 to $750. Also, when choosing a pathway, you should consider the future stand conditions. So the Forest Vegetation Simulator, FVS, is a really good tool for comparing different treatment options. And the USDA Forest Service created this, and more specifically, the Forest Management Service Center in Colorado has been managing it. And basically what this system is it provides simulations for many silvicultural methods for most tree species and different stand conditions. So this is an example of an FVS. This is specific to the USAL forest and the treatments that we will be discussing. And throughout our presentation, we'll be analyzing specific parts of this data.
And using that knowledge, we were able to narrow down our choices to specific pathways. We looked at a treatment of a control which had no treatment, a variable retention in pathway 2, which had 2 instances of frilling, selection harvest, and then plant in pathway 13. We also looked at the goals. So in terms of goal 1, the control met this in 2080 by having the highest average conifer diameter and average tree height, and this resembles the large wide trees in pre-settlement USAL. We determined this by looking at the group A DBH and height in the table below. However, the forest remains dense and dominated by hardwoods in this pathway. For pathway 2, it achieved the pre-settlement look by using variable retention, which creates a clumpy gappy forest mosaic. This pathway also resulted in the highest percent of redwoods and the lowest percent of hardwoods. However, the diameter of the conifers were not the highest. In pathway 13, there was the least amount of trees per acre, which really opens up the land for future growth and allows trees to grow wide like pre-settlement conditions. And it also exhibited a higher percent of conifers and redwoods and a lower percent of hardwoods than the control. But since a variable retention is not being used, the same clumpy gappy effect is not created. And while this pathway increases conifers overall, there are more Douglas firs than redwoods in 2080. Here is a FES image. As we can see, pathways 2 and 13 are less dense than control, and 13 is the most spread of them all.
So here's another visualization. On the x-axis, we have diameter at breast height, and on the y-axis, we have basal area. The orange blocks are redwoods, the gray are hardwoods, and the blue are Douglas fir. So seeing the current stand conditions, there are definitely not enough redwoods, and the diameters are relatively kind of small. For control year in 2080, the diameters have, on average, increased a bit, but the species composition has not changed very much. For pathway 2, by year 2080, the redwoods have increased a lot, and the hardwoods and Douglas fir have decreased a lot too. But it is okay that the diameters are a bit on the small side. And then for pathway 13, the diameters have increased a bit and the hardwoods have decreased. So looking at this, you can see that pathway 2 is the best for forest restoration.
So next, I will be discussing goal 2, which is creating an economic benefit. To calculate the cost for each path, you have to take the log value, the logging cost, the hauling cost, and add them together. And you have to multiply that by the NBF per acre and then subtract the planting and treatment cost. So for the control pathway, there is no gain or loss. However, for pathway 2, there is a deduction of $318.57. Pathway 2 uses variable retention, which means harvesting at year 0 when the trees are still small, so there isn't as much of an economic benefit. However, also pathway 2 uses frilling twice, which means that a total of $400 per acre is being deducted. Pathway 13 is quite the opposite, and it has a gain of $637.28. Pathway 13 uses selection harvest, which means harvesting the trees at 15 years when the trees are larger, so it provides more economic benefits. And frilling is only used once, so only $200 per acre is being deducted.
So goal 3 is minimizing the use of herbicides, and this is used in the frilling treatment. So obviously in the control, there's no frilling done, so there's no herbicide use. In pathway 2, frilling is done twice, so this uses the most amount of pesticides and herbicides. And then pathway 3, this is kind of in the middle where frilling is only used once, so only some pesticides are used. And the picture at the bottom kind of shows the 4 units and how there aren't any major water reservoirs, so the risk of herbicide or pesticide runoff is lessened. Goal 4 is carbon sequestration. Obviously, the more carbon sequestered, the better. So the control has the most amount of carbon sequestered purely because there's no trees being cut down, so it has the most amount of tree area. In pathway 2, this has the least amount of carbon sequestered. And then in pathway 13, this is again kind of in the middle.
So a secondary land ownership goal was to reduce the fire risk. We compared the 2080 probabilities of torching and Crown Index. The 3 pathways don't differ drastically in the reduction, so this part of the data couldn't convince us that one pathway was better than the others.
So to finish off our presentation, we want to present our preferred treatment. And so this is kind of our goal summary, and our table lists the pros and cons of each pathway. And so we didn't go with the control, but in pathway 2, as you can see, this has the most amount of redwood restoration, but this comes at the expense of all of the other goals. So there is a pretty large economic deficit, as well as it doesn't really meet the second tier goals such as herbicide or lessening herbicide use and increased carbon sequestration. Pathway 3 is kind of a compromise between all of the goals in which there's an acceptable amount of redwood restoration. There's a huge economic benefit, and all of the other second tier goals are pretty adequately met.
So overall, we recommend pathway 13 because it provides a very high economic benefit. There's an acceptable percent of conifers, and these trees are large and sparsely distributed, which imitates the pre-settlement conditions that we want. There's not too many herbicides that are being used, and there's a decent carbon sequestration, along with a medium to low probability of torching. Overall, pathway 13 provides a reasonable compromise to moderately meet all of the goals. Thank you.
All right. Now let's move on to the question and answer period. I'm going to reset my timer to 5 minutes. And it's perfectly okay to share your slides during the question and answer period. And I'll also hold up the 1 minute timer card once we get down to it. When someone asks a question, I'll start the timer.
All right, this is Robert Little. I'll go first. In one of your slides, you described when we were talking about GHG storage benefit. In one of the slides, it said that the no option method would store the most GHG. However, even though that looks the best for GHG, is there a concern with if they were to stick with the no option? Would there be a risk to that GHG value if they weren't going to do anything?
Is this for carbon sequestration?
Yeah, for carbon sequestration. Yeah, that's the slide right there. So even though the control shows the highest storage, is there a concern about viability of that storage into the future, and what would the biggest threat to it be?
Since this stand would be kind of crowded, I think it would be more likely for there to be a fire hazard. And if a fire hazard was to come, then a lot of the carbon would be released because the forest would be burned.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for you. This is Jeannie Tomaszewski. Did you participate in the Ask a Forester sessions? I know that you mentioned you talked to the man from USAL Forest and you talked to another forester from El Dorado. I was wondering if you got information from anybody else.
So David Thompson, oh,
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Oh, I can go. So David Thompson, the forester that works at El Dorado, was part of the Ask a Forester. We also asked 2 other foresters. So we asked a college student at the Oregon State University, and he explained to us we asked him a lot about the frilling and manual treatment, and he told us that for frilling, it's really effective because on the contrary manual treatment, the tan oaks are really resilient, so they tend to grow again. So on the other hand, frilling, which infiltrates to the roots, is more effective.
Okay, thank you.
I really, I'm almost flabbergasted. That was awesome. I think you did a really good job presenting all that information. I really have, I mean, you really tackled everything that you were supposed to tackle, I believe. And but I do want to ask you a question about your basal area factor using the prisms of the 20 and the 40. Can you tell me what the difference would be using the 40 and the 20?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so basal area factor is kind of just assuming the cross-sectional area of every tree to be a certain amount. So 40 would be a greater basal area because it's 40 feet squared per tree. And they generally use that because it's like a good way to measure it. But sometimes they would use 20 feet squared per tree because if the region was like recently harvested or other conditions which make not enough in trees, then they would use a smaller basal area factor of 20. So yeah, if that answers your question.
So the 20 pulls in smaller trees.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And again, great job.
Yeah, I really liked you guys' presentation. I thought you guys kept a really good job of keeping everything organized, referring back to your outline. And refrain from having kind of an abundance of information on the side and just the necessary information, not overloading anything. I think you guys did a really good job.
Thanks.
Have any of you had the chance to do a forestry challenge in person in the woods?
No, for all of us, this is our first year, and unfortunately, we're online. But after this year, maybe we'll consider doing it next year in our senior year.
Oh, that would be great. We'd love to see you out in the woods. I also think you did a really good job, and it'll just be a lot more fun to be out there in the forest, seeing everything in person.
All right, it looks like our question and answer period is over. Really, really good job, you guys. Really loved your presentation. I'd just like to remind you to write your thank you note. That's worth 10 points to your final score. So I think it's the team evaluation and the thank you note. Really great job.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
good
you.
luck.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everyone.
ladies.
Thank you. Good luck.